She's been told to use a nappy, and she's not incontinent. She's got to deliberately soil herself because they won't provide care for her at night because of government cuts. That's the reality of the cuts on us as disabled people.
$20 million. Well, for 20 years, that little escaped money could keep these libraries open.
All of this will be flattened under the current proposals.
Quality secondary school, and frankly, if you don't mind getting out of my face, I'd appreciate that.
Why are you worried about
Not only were they part responsible for this financial crisis, but they're being let off up to £20 million in tax.
These cuts are not working. They're not working for the economy. They're not working for the people who rely on our services. They are completely unjust and they must be stopped.
The UK is just beginning to experience the deepest public sector cuts for generations. Only 15% of those cuts have so far been implemented. This is a film about the impact of those cuts, but it is also a film about the alternative. Later this year, UK Uncut Legal Action will be taking the tax office to court over a decision to reduce Goldman Sachs' tax bill by £20 million. This film looks at the details of that case, but also at the scale of global tax avoidance. We'll start with one section of society that are arguably the hardest hit by the spending cuts.
My name is Anne Novis. I'm a disabled person, a wheelchair user, and I became a disabled person about 18 years ago now.
It is the welfare reform bill that is creating so much of the anxiety that disabled people are experiencing. The bill introduces a target of £11 billion worth of spending cuts and regular fitness for work tests that many say ignore professional medical opinion. Fail the test and you lose your benefits.
I've seen many people who are more poorly than me and more disabled than me fail the ESA tests, fitness for work tests. What will happen, which I suspect will happen to me, is that they will decide I'm fit for work. This means I will either go into two groups. One is a group where, with support, they will make you fit for work. And the other one is you get put straight on job seekers allowance and are expected to look for work yourself straight away. Either of those also include forced labour, in that you will be made to do voluntary work in any venue they decide. It can't be like, I already do voluntary activities, so that doesn't count. It has to be like in Poundland or Tesco's or something they choose. I have known people, a very ill person, being put in a garden centre to work 5 days a week, full-time hours, who has chronic pain like I do, be expected to do physical work. And if I don't do it, like she faced by not doing it, you lose the benefit.
Anne was awarded an MBE for her work on disability hate crime.
Just as we were beginning to get that awareness of people accepting that people did actually attack disabled people just because they were a disabled person, that I would then see an increase in that hostility due to the way this government has verbalised and incited hostility towards us by calling us scroungers, unsustainable, work-shy fraudsters. I had a man said that I was a nuisance and a burden on the state and should have been killed at birth. And as I was not killed at birth, he was going to kill me there and then. And I had two other people with me at that time who had to step in front of this man to stop him hitting me.
Anne is also facing a proposed reduction in local authority care.
Every minute that's reduced in your care hours counts. So they wanted to reduce by about 6 hours a week. That would have meant something like, okay, I couldn't go and see my elderly mum in hospital because I need carers with me to do that. Or I wouldn't be able to go shopping or take my animal to the vet, or a meeting with other disabled people. It just affects everything. The basics would mean I'd be on my own. And sadly, many people now have taken their own lives. And many people are considering it if things do actually go through is what we've heard it's going to go through. And I have to admit that I've thought about that too.
Local authority budgets are also hitting library services. Kensal Rise Library in the London Borough of Brent was first established by the community in the 19th century. Despite its closure in October 2010, the community are still campaigning hard to save their library.
My name is Margaret Bailey. I'm the co-chair of the Save Kensal Rise Library campaign. I've lived around here for over 30 years, and I'm part of the community response to stopping this library from closure. Given that the library has been very run down by the council for some time, it's a library that was very well used by young people, under fives, young people doing their homework, older people as a sort of meeting place to read newspapers. There's nothing else in this community, no other free public space where people can meet. And the library, I think, has served that purpose, for some time. And to lose it, I think, would have a big impact on this community, very big impact. The day that we lost the judicial review, the council tried to board up and close all the 6 libraries in Brent that they had earmarked for closure, including this one. And we had a 24-hour vigil stopping them boarding up our library and taking the books out. We had banks of women and children surrounding the library, stopping the workmen getting into the library. When we were defending the library from being boarded up, it was just suggested that maybe we should run our own library. So that idea seemed to be popular. People started turning up with donations of books. We had this little structure built. We're maintaining a library on library land. We're providing a service to the community. The community still wants a library. We've been operating since October, 7 days a week, providing the service, an actual service, and of course a very symbolic service showing that this community still wants this library, or a library in this community.
Campaigners in Wandsworth are trying to stop the council selling off 56% of Elliott School to housing developers.
My name's Ed Lattimore. I used to come to Elliott School between 93 and 99. I've been a resident of Wandsworth Borough for 25 years. 93 was the year Elliott became recognised by the authorities as being of particular architectural significance. It was given its Grade 2 listed status in 1993. However, the building, even then, was seriously dilapidated. I remember rusty frames and windows rattling and seeing cracked renders and holes in the render and being able to see, almost the structure coming through. Yet this was our school, and we were very proud of our school.
Under Building Schools for the Future programme, Labour had planned to invest £2 billion into comprehensive schools across the country.
The budget for BSF, for Elliott's refurbishment, was around 40 million. All the things that the building desperately needed were included and itemised in the BSF refurbishment programme. So the fact that when the coalition government came into power in 2010, one of the first things they did was immediately scrap the BSF. Fundamentally, the Conservative Party, and therefore the coalition, were not in agreement with providing this degree of funding to state schools.
Now the council say the only way to fund the refurbishment is by selling land.
The plan is to sell off 56% of the land that the site sits on. So essentially the new site boundary cuts right down the centre, right through the listed building. We lose the nature reserve, built using community donations and student help. We lose 6 tennis courts, multi-purpose pitches. We lose the performance stage, the athletics facilities, the multi-purpose sports pitch, and critically, we lose the Grade 2 listed sports hall and technology wing. All of this will be flattened under the current proposals.
How many houses they're going to build?
The schedule of accommodation states around 105 new houses.
There are, however, multi-million-pound investments going to other schools in the area.
There are plans for a new free school on the site of the Bolingbroke Hospital down in the Northcote ward, as we know, one of a very affluent area of Wandsworth. I think the site cost Wandsworth 13 million, and that's before they've refurbished and developed the building into a school. You know, it was a hospital once, so that will be a costly exercise itself. It's a central government directive, free schools. Therefore, Wandsworth say the reason there's no money for Elliot is because it forms a different budget. Simple. BSF money was Labour money. Free schools and academy money is coalition money.
Quality secondary
One of Elliot School's governors is local MP Justine Greening.
school, and frankly, if you don't mind getting out of my face, I'd appreciate that.
Why are you worried about
Justine, I see you're wearing the Olympic badge there, but yet you're endorsing 350% reduction in the outdoor sports facilities on this site.
I'm afraid that I'm very happy to get any alternatives you've got about how we can improve this building, and I look forward to getting
not
them.
remove the rear aspect.
You come up with some alternatives about how you can do it without removing all of the things that you care about.
Why don't you disclose the financial justification to the public so we can actually...
Free schools. How much is being invested into free schools?
No,
we can't talk about free schools. How big is the pot for free schools in the local area? 30 million? 30 million being put into free schools?
Do you think we should...
No. Walk away. Central government funds. Just a quick comment.
Elliot said, here is this wonderful building with these wonderful facilities set in beautiful landscaped gardens. You know, they weren't cooped up in a dark school with small windows. They were encouraged to dream and look out over the landscape.
If you won't pay your tax, we'll shut you down. If you won't pay your tax, if you won't pay your tax, if you won't pay your tax, we'll shut you down.
Since 2010, UK Uncut have been protesting against the cuts by targeting tax-avoiding companies. Inspired by those protests, UK Uncut Legal Action are extending the protest movement into the courts.
So yes, there are alternatives to the cuts. The cuts are not necessary. They're an ideology put forward by our current government. So £25 billion a year is lost to big businesses and individuals who are avoiding tax. This tax could be used to put into vital services that are needed by the most vulnerable in society, for example, welfare or the NHS, the National Health Service.
In 2008, the greed and gambling by the finance industry unravelled, forcing the government to pump in excess of £850 billion of taxpayers' money into the banks. We are now all paying off that debt through cuts in public services. Yet some economists believe around $11 trillion globally is stashed away in tax havens by the super rich. That amount could pay off the entire UK national debt about 7 times over. It is the finance industry that lies at the heart of this global system of tax avoidance.
Tax havens have been around for decades, if not centuries. There's a timeline which could take them back to the mid-19th century. In America, they tend to be called secrecy jurisdictions, and I think that American expression is by far the best, because tax havens or secrecy jurisdictions are, in some respects, little black boxes where profits disappear. And they do this because we have some fundamental fault lines in the globalized economy. Capital, businesses operate globally, no restriction, or by and large no restriction on their operations. But tax systems, by and large, operate nationally, and there's very little international cooperation on tax matters. And the multinational companies are in a very good position to exploit that failure of cooperation. So the rules have been framed in a way which supports the interests of multinational companies, and they can use tax havens to dump their profits, not in the place where they're being created, but in a place where they don't have to pay tax or pay only minimal tax on their profits. Virtually every single product and service is now traded via tax havens in order to shift profits through them. So it isn't a case of a few isolated bad mash companies. This is systemic, and it explains why wealth has become concentrated in the hands of an ever decreasing number of multinational companies, and wealth isn't trickling down, it's actually gushing upwards into the hands of a very small number of players. Even in the United Kingdom, the figures are so large, the lower estimates are so large, that it's clear that the austerity regime which is being imposed upon us is quite simply a political option amongst others. This is a political agenda. You can either choose to crack down on tax evasion and tax avoidance, or you can choose to cut back on public services. The current coalition has chosen to do the latter, but there is clearly an alternative option.
There is growing concern over the way that corporate tax affairs are being handled by the government and the tax office. It's clear that HMRC is striking negotiated tax deals with companies that see millions, if not billions, wiped off their tax bills. In July 2010, communications giant Vodafone successfully renegotiated a tax bill from £7 billion all the way down to just £1.25 billion. Later that year, Dave Hartnett, who was then head of HMRC, shook hands on a settlement with Goldman Sachs that saw the banking giant keep the £20 million worth of interest it owed. It is that tax deal that UK Uncut Legal Action are challenging in the High Court with the help of public law experts Lee Day & Co. Here's Rosa Curling explaining the key details of the case.
So, as far as we understand, and from the information available in the public domain, in the 1990s, Goldman Sachs set up basically a tax avoidance scheme to try and avoid having to pay national insurance contributions for staff that were employed by them in London. Goldman Sachs wasn't the only company that tried to do this. There was a number of others who also tried to do it. And HMRC began to investigate these schemes, and they were of the view that they weren't lawful. You have a very strong indication from the court that the HMRC are on the right legal grounds, that their view that the avoidance scheme is unlawful is correct, and that they should be seeking to recover all the tax owed by Goldman Sachs. So against that background, there is a meeting held between HMRC and Goldman Sachs, where in essence we understand that Dave Hartnett shook hands with Goldman Sachs and agreed that HMRC would not seek to recover £20 million worth of interest owed. Now, the solicitor and the lawyers who were involved in advising HMRC makes clear in a memo that's been leaked that he was of the view that wasn't the right decision. And what the HMRC policy guidance makes clear is when it is likely for you to be able to recover the full amount of tax owed in cases like this where there's been a dispute, then HMRC is under a legal duty to try and recover that money. In this case, they chose not to do that, and that's what we're saying is unlawful.
Richard Brooks is a former tax inspector and now private eye journalist. He has been following the key details of this case.
What we know is that Mr. Hartnett came in to a meeting, he says, to smooth over a relationship issue, and the company walked away with a smaller bill than it should have been given because it was let off this interest. Now, that's been put down as an error rather than a deliberate decision. But we have no evidence of that. We don't know what precisely the error was. We're not allowed to know. We don't know why the error wasn't overturned. We do know that it could have been overturned, that Mr. Hartnett shook hands on this, but he could then have written to them and said, sorry, we made a mistake. But he didn't. But we don't know why. It looks like it was a bit of a face-saving exercise. HMRC certainly needs more resources, and it needs to rethink its approach to dealing with the wealthiest taxpayers. It's in the last 10 years or so, it's had two major reviews which have both said that it should become closer and cosier with large business.
In other words, HM Revenue and Customs was told be a soft touch. And that's how it's come through in reality. We've been doing these deals with the Goldman Sachs and the Vodafones, and the deals stank. And we were right to expose them, full marks to organisations like Private Eye, for example, and organisations like Uncut for taking to the streets, because these deals stink. They're not in Britain's interest at all.
Rich individuals and big businesses have been manipulating the law and using various loopholes to avoid over 25 billion a year in tax. And now we're using the law to say, pay your tax.
This case should go to court because there's a clear case to answer here. I mean, this is £20 million of money that hasn't been collected. Dave Hartnett, the guy who actually sat down and struck this deal, admitted he didn't even get legal advice before doing it. And there's a clear public interest here. This is about an enormous programme of cuts and about an entire way of settling tax. And this needs to be heard and it needs to be resolved.
This library and the 5 other libraries in Brent, their closures costing Brent, is saving Brent £1 million. What are you saying, the Goldman Sachs?
20 million.
20 million. Well, for 20 years, that little escaped money could keep these libraries open.
I feel sick to my stomach because when you hear the government and local authorities trying to justify the fact that they can't give enough care to an elderly person, or to a case we had recently of a lady who needed nighttime assistance to use a toilet. She's been told to use a nappy and she's not incontinent. She's got to deliberately soil herself because they won't provide care for her at night because of government cuts. That's the reality of the cuts on us as disabled people, that we can't even use a toilet, be assisted to use a toilet.